So 3, 2, 1, and it's now.
To make you aware that the seminar is being recorded. So Joanne Conway is the current chair of ICLO-NLS. She is a psychoanalyst in Dublin, practicing in private practice. She has lectured for many years in the Masters in Psychoanalysis in Ireland. She's a member of the New Lacanian School and of the World Association of Psychoanalysis. And she's going to be reading the 3rd chapter of this seminal paper by Freud. Veronique Voruz needs no introduction. She is a very close colleague based in the UK and France. She has been working with ICLO for many years and has been vital in the transmission and the formation of analysts in Ireland. It's always a pleasure to listen to her, to have the opportunity to bear witness to her original and lively reading of any of the texts that orient us in our work. She's a member of the École de la Cause Freudienne, a member of the NLS and of the World Association of Psychoanalysis. She's also a lecturer in criminology in the UK. She was an analyst of the school. Her mandate finished some time ago. And we have very much followed her transmission as an analyst of the school within the NLS and within the WUP in general. She has been editor of La Cause du Désir, a very close contributor and also deputy editor of the Lacanian Review. And she coordinates, I have the honor and the pleasure of coordinating with Veronique the Nottingham Dublin Lacanian Studies Programme under the aegis of U4K, continuous formation in France. So I welcome everyone. 120 people have logged in so far. We are delighted to have this space to come together and reread Freud from the place that we find ourselves in. As previously, you're welcome to write your questions and commentary, your contributions via the chat. And at the end of the meeting, we will have, of course, a conversation and a discussion. I'm aware that a lot of colleagues from the NLS or groups pertaining to the NLS have joined us since our last meeting, from Bulgaria, from Greece, from Austria. So I welcome them all. And I give now the floor to Joanne, who's going to...
Thank you very much, Florencia. And yes, I'm echoing your words also. It's really special to be here with all of you this morning in this virtual world at the moment of reading Freud. So it's a great privilege to be here and to see you all and hear you all. So I'll begin. As you say, I'm starting on chapter 3. I will read slowly, but if I'm going too fast, you can tell me. Okay. And so we begin. Our inquiry concerning happiness has not so far taught us much that is not already common knowledge. And even if we proceed from it to the problem of why it is so hard for men to be happy, there seems no greater prospect of learning anything new. We have given the answer already by pointing to the three sources from which our suffering comes: the superior power of nature, the feebleness of our own bodies, and the inadequacy of the regulations which adjust the mutual relationships of human beings in the family, the state, and society. In regard to the first two sources, our judgment cannot hesitate long. It forces us to acknowledge those sources of suffering and to submit to the inevitable. We shall never completely master nature, and our bodily organism, itself a part of that nature, will always remain a transient structure with a limited capacity for adaptation and achievement. This recognition does not have a paralyzing effect. On the contrary, it points the direction for our activity. If we cannot remove all suffering, we can remove some, and we can mitigate some. The experience of many thousands of years has convinced us of that. As regards the third source, the social source of suffering, our attitude is a different one. We do not admit it at all. We cannot see why the regulations made by ourselves should not, on the contrary, be a protection and a benefit for every one of us. And yet, when we consider how unsuccessful we have been in precisely this field of prevention of suffering, a suspicion dawns on us that here too, a piece of unconquerable nature may lie behind, this time a piece of our own psychical constitution. When we start considering the possibility, we come upon a contention which is so astonishing that we must dwell upon it. The contention holds that what we call our civilization is largely responsible for our misery, and that we should be much happier if we gave it up and returned to primitive conditions. I call this contention astonishing because in whatever way we may define the concept of civilization, it is a certain fact that all the things with which we seek to protect ourselves against the threats that emanate from the sources of suffering are part of that very civilization. How has it happened that so many people have come to take up this strange attitude of hostility to civilization? I believe that the basis of it was a deep and long-standing dissatisfaction with the then existing state of civilization, and that on that basis, a condemnation of it was built up, occasioned by certain specific historical events. I think I know what the last and the last but one of those occasions were. I am not learned enough to trace the chain of them far back enough in the history of the human species. But a factor of this kind, hostile to civilization, must already have been at work in the victory of Christendom over the heathen religions. For it was very closely related to the low estimation put upon earthly life by the Christian doctrine. The last but one of these occasions was when the progress of voyages of discovery led to contact with primitive peoples and races. In consequence of insufficient observation and a mistaken view of their manners and customs, they appeared to Europeans to be leading a simple, happy life, with few wants, a life such as was unattainable by their visitors with their superior civilization. Later, experience has corrected some of those judgments. In many cases, the observers had wrongly attributed to the absence of complicated cultural demands what was in fact due to the bounty of nature and the ease with which the major human needs were satisfied. The last occasion is especially familiar to us. It arose when people came to know about the mechanism of the neurosis, which threatened to undermine the modicum of happiness enjoyed by civilized men. It was discovered that a person becomes neurotic because he cannot tolerate the amount of frustration which society imposes on him in the service of its cultural ideals, and it was inferred from this that the abolition or reduction of those demands would result in a return to possibilities of happiness. There is also an added factor of disappointment. During the last few generations, mankind has made an extraordinary advance in the natural sciences and in their technical application, and has established his control over nature in a way never before imagined. The single steps of this advance are common knowledge, and it is unnecessary to enumerate them. Men are proud of those achievements and have a right to be, but they seem to have observed that this newly won power over space and time, the subjugation of the forces of nature, which is the fulfillment of a longing that goes back thousands of years, has not increased the amount of pleasurable satisfaction which they may lack in life, and has not made them feel happier. From the recognition of this fact, we ought to be content to conclude that power over nature is not the only precondition of human happiness, just as it is not the only goal of cultural endeavor. We ought not to infer from it that technical progress is without value for the economics of our happiness. One would like to ask, is there then no positive gain in pleasure, no unequivocal increase in my feeling of happiness, if I can, as often as I please, hear the voice of a child of mine who is living hundreds of miles away, or if I can learn in the shortest possible time after a friend has reached his destination, that he has come through the long and difficult voyage unharmed? Does it mean nothing that medicine has succeeded in enormously reducing infant mortality and the danger of infection for women in childbirth, and indeed in considerably lengthening the average life of a civilized man? And there is a long list that might be added to the benefits of this kind, which we owe to the much despised era of scientific and technical advances. But here, the voice of pessimistic criticism makes itself heard and warns that the most of these satisfactions follow the model of the cheap enjoyment extolled in the anecdote, the enjoyment obtained by putting a bare leg from under the bedclothes on a cold winter night and drawing it in again. If there had been no railway to conquer distances, my child would never have left his native town, and I should need no telephone to hear his voice. If traveling across the ocean by ship had not been introduced, my friend would not have embarked on his sea voyage, and I should not need a cable to relieve my anxiety about him. What is the use of reducing infantile mortality when it is precisely that reduction which imposes the greatest restraint on us in the begetting of children, so that, taken all round, we nevertheless rear no more children than in the days before the reign of hygiene, while at the same time we have created difficult conditions for our sexual life in marriage, and have probably worked against the beneficial effects of natural selection. And finally, what good to us is a long life, if it is difficult and barren of joys, and if it is so full of misery that we can only welcome death as a deliverer?
Freud is a glass half empty.
It's a very upbeat text for a Saturday morning, yes? Continue. It seems certain that we do not feel comfortable in our present day civilization, but it is very difficult to form an opinion whether and in what degree men of an earlier age felt happier and what part of their cultural conditions played in the matter. We should always tend to consider people's distress objectively, that is, to place ourselves with our own wants and sensibilities in their conditions, and then to examine what occasions we should find in them for experiencing happiness or unhappiness. This method of looking at things which seems objective because it ignores the variations in subjective sensibility, is, of course, the most subjective possible, since it puts one's own mental states in the place of any others, unknown though they may be. Happiness, however, is something essentially subjective. No matter how much we may shrink from from certain situations of a galley slave in antiquity, of a peasant during the 30 Years' War, of a victim of the Holy Inquisition, of a Jew awaiting a pogrom, it is nevertheless impossible for us to feel our way into such people, to divine the changes which original obtuseness of mind, a gradual stupefying process, the cessation of expectations, and cruder or more refined methods of narcotization have produced upon their receptivity to sensations of pleasure and unpleasure. Moreover, in the case of the extreme possibility of suffering, special mental protective devices are brought into operation. It seems to me unprofitable to pursue this aspect of the problem any further. It is time for us to turn our attention to the nature of the civilization on whose value as a means to happiness doubts have been thrown. We shall not look for a formula in which to express that nature in a few words, until we have learned something by examining it. We shall therefore content ourselves with saying once more that the word civilization describes the whole sum of the achievements and the regulations which distinguish our lives from those of our animal ancestors, and which serve two purposes, namely to protect men against nature and to adjust their mutual relations. In order to learn more, we will bring together the various features of civilization individually as they are exhibited in human communities. In doing so, we will have no hesitation in letting ourselves be guided by linguistic usage, or, as it is also called, linguistic feeling, in the conviction that we shall thus be doing justice to inner discernments which still defy expression in abstract terms. The first stage is easy. We recognize as cultural all activities and resources which are useful to men for making the earth serviceable to them, for protecting them against the violence of the forces of nature, and so on. As regards this side of civilization, there can be scarcely any doubt. If we go back far enough, we find that the first acts of civilization were the use of tools, the gaining of control over fire, and the construction of dwellings. Among these, the control of fire over fire stands out as quite an extraordinary and unexampled achievement, while the others opened up paths which man has followed ever since, and the stimulus to which is easily guessed. And here there's quite a long footnote that Freud points to around the phallic nature of fire, but we won't be reading that this morning.
We might perhaps simply underline that in the footnote,
Mm-hmm.
the idea of renunciation.
Yes.
It's very important because the whole of the Freudian construction rests on this idea of, I'm just going to read the sentence.
Okay.
A little bit louder, Veronique, please.
It's about the putting out of fire.
Mm-hmm.
The first person to renounce this desire and spare the fire was able to carry it off with him and subdue it to its own use. I'm just underlining that in the footnote we find this idea of renunciation to immediate satisfaction as the foundation of civilization.
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
And also draws the correlation to infantile sexuality with the case of Dora also, etc. Anyway, I'll go on. I've lost my place now. Oh no, I found it. Okay. With every tool, man is perfecting his own organs, whether motor or sensory, or is removing the limits to their functioning. Motor power places gigantic forces at his disposal, which, like his muscles, he can employ in any direction. Thanks to ships and aircraft, neither water nor air can hinder his movements. By means of spectacles, he corrects defects in the lens of his own eye. By means of the telescope, he sees into the far distance. And by means of the microscope, he overcomes the limits of visibility set by the structure of his retina. In the photographic camera, he has created an instrument which retains the fleeting visual impressions, just as a gramophone disc retains the equally fleeting auditory ones. Both are at bottom materializations of the power he possesses, of recollection, his memory. With the help of the telephone, he can hear at distances which would be respected as unattainable, even in a fairy tale. Writing was, in its origin, the voice of an absent person, and the dwelling house was a substitute for the mother's womb, the first lodging, for which in all likelihood man still longs, and in which he was safe and felt at ease. These things that by his science and technology man has brought about on this earth, on which he first appeared as a feeble animal organism, and on which each individual of his species must once more make its entry, O inch of nature, as a helpless suckling. These things do not only sound like a fairy tale, they are an actual fulfillment of every, or of almost every, fairy tale wish. All these assets he may lay claim to as his cultural acquisition. Long ago, he formed an ideal conception of omnipotence and omniscience, which he embodied in his gods. To these gods, he attributed everything that seemed unattainable to his wishes, or that was forbidden to him. One may say, therefore, that these gods were cultural ideals. Today, he has come very close to the attainment of this ideal. He has almost become a god himself. Only it is true in the fashion in which ideals are usually attained according to the general judgment of humanity. Not completely, in some respects not at all, in others only halfway. Man has, as it were, become a kind of prosthetic god. When he puts on all his auxiliary organs, he is truly magnificent. But those organs have not grown onto him, and they still give him much trouble at times. Nevertheless, he is entitled to console himself with the thought that this development will not come to an end precisely with the year 1930 AD. Future ages will bring with them new and probably unimaginably great advances in this field of civilization, and will increase man's likeness to God still more. But in the interests of our investigations, we will not forget that present-day man does not feel happy in his godlike character. We recognize then that countries have attained a high level of civilization if we find that in them everything which can assist in the exploitation of the earth by man and his protection against the forces of nature, everything in short which is of use to him, is attended to and effectively carried out. In such countries, rivers which threaten to flood the land are regulated in their flow, and their water is directed through canals to places where there is a shortage of it. The soil is carefully cultivated and planted with vegetation, which it is suited to support, and the mineral wealth below ground is assiduously brought to the surface and fashioned into the required implements and utensils. The means of communication are ample, rapid, and reliable. Wild and dangerous animals have been exterminated, and the breeding of domesticated animals flourishes. But we demand other things from civilization besides these. And it is a noticeable fact that we hope to find them realized in the same countries. As though we were seeking to repudiate the first demand we made, we welcome it as a sign of civilization as well if we see people directing their care to what has no practical value whatever and to what is useless. If, for instance, the green spaces necessary in a town as playgrounds and as reservoirs of fresh air are also laid out with flower beds, or if the windows of the houses are decorated with pots of flowers. We soon observe that this useless thing, which we expect civilization to value, is beauty. We require civilized man to reverence beauty whenever he sees it in nature, and to create it in the objects of his handiworks, so far as he is able. But this is far from exhausting our demands on civilization. We expect, besides, to see the signs of cleanliness and order. We do not think highly of the cultural level of an English country town in Shakespeare's time when we read that there was a big dung heap in front of his father's house in Stratford. We are indignant and call it barbarous, which is the opposite of civilized, when we find the paths of the Wienerwald littered with paper. Dirtiness of any kind seems to us incompatible with civilization. We extend our demand for cleanliness to the human body too. We are astonished to learn of the objectionable smell which emanated from the Roi Soleil, and we shake our heads on the Isola Bella when we are shown the tiny wash basin in which Napoleon made his morning toilet. Indeed, we are not surprised by the idea of setting up the use of soap as an actual yardstick of civilization. The same is true of order. It, like cleanliness, applies solely to the works of man. But whereas cleanliness is not to be expected in nature, order, on the contrary, has been imitated from her. Man's observations of the great astronomical regularities not only furnished him with a model for introducing order into his life, but gave him the first points of departure for doing so. Order is a kind of compulsion to repeat, which, when a regulation has been laid down once and for all, decides when, where, and how a thing shall be done, so that in every similar circumstance, one is spared hesitation and indecision. The benefits of order are incontestable. It enables men to use space and time to the best advantage, while conserving their psychical forces. We should have a right to expect that order would have taken its place in human activities from the start and without difficulty. And we may well wonder that this has not happened, that on the contrary, human beings exhibit an inborn tendency to carelessness, irregularity, and unreliability in their work, and that a laborious training is needed before they learn to follow the example of their celestial models. Beauty, cleanliness, and order obviously occupy a special position among the requirements of civilization. No one will maintain that they are as important for life as control over the forces of nature, or as some other factors with which we shall become acquainted. And yet no one would care to put them in the background as trivialities. That civilization is not exclusively taken up with what is useful is already shown by the example of beauty, which we decline to admit from among the interests of civilization. The usefulness of order is quite evident. With regard to cleanliness, we must bear in mind that it is demanded of us by hygiene as well, and we may suspect that even before the days of scientific prophylaxis, the connection between the two was not altogether strange to man. Yet, utility does not entirely explain these efforts. something else must be at work besides. No feature, however, seems better to characterize civilization than its esteem and encouragement of man's higher mental activities, his intellectual, scientific, and artistic achievements, and the leading role that it assigns to ideas in human life. Foremost among those ideas are the religious systems, on whose complicated structure I have endeavored to throw light elsewhere. Next come the speculations of philosophy, and finally what might be called man's ideals, his ideas of a possible perfection of individuals, or of peoples, or of the whole of humanity, and the demands he sets up on the basis of such ideas. The fact that these creations of his are not independent of one another, but are, on the contrary, closely interwoven, increases the difficulty not only of describing them, but of tracing their psychological derivation. If we assume quite generally that the motive force of all human activities is a striving towards the two confluent goals of utility and a yield of pleasure, we must suppose that this is also true of the manifestations of civilization which we have been discussing here, although this is easily visible only in scientific and aesthetic activities. But it cannot be doubted that the other activities too correspond to strong needs in men, perhaps to needs which are only developed in a minority. Nor must we allow ourselves to be misled by judgments of value concerning any particular religion or philosophic system or ideal. Whether we think to find in them the highest achievement of the human spirit, or whether we deplore them as aberrations, we cannot but recognize that where they are present, and in especial where they are dominant, a high level of civilization is implied. The last, but certainly not the least important of the characteristic features of civilization remains to be assessed: the manner in which the relationships of men to one another, their social relationships, are regulated. Relationships which affect a person as a neighbor, as a source of help, as another person's sexual object, as a member of a family and of a state. Here it is especially difficult to keep clear of particular ideal demands and see what is civilized in general. Perhaps we may begin by explaining that the element of civilization enters on the scene with the first attempt to regulate these social relationships. If the attempt were not made, the relationship would be subject to the arbitrary will of the individual. That is to say, the physically stronger man would decide them in the sense of his own interests and instinctual impulses. Nothing would be changed in this if the stronger man should, in his turn, meet someone even stronger than he. Human life in common is only made possible when a majority comes together which is stronger than any separate individual and which remains united against all separate individuals. The power of this community is then set up as right in opposition to the power of the individual, which is condemned as brute force. This replacement of the power of the individual by the power of a community constitutes the decisive step of civilization. The essence of it lies in the fact that the members of the community restrict themselves in their possibilities of satisfaction, whereas the individual knew no such restrictions. The first requisite of civilization, therefore, is that of justice. That is, the assurance that a law once made will not be broken in favor of an individual. This implies nothing as to the ethical value of such a law. The further course of cultural development seems to tend towards making the law no longer an expression of the will of a small community, a caste, or a stratum of the population or a racial group, which in its turn behaves like a violent individual towards other and perhaps more numerous collections of people. The final outcome should be a rule of law to which all, except those who are not capable of entering a community, have contributed by a sacrifice of their instincts, and which leaves no one, again, with the same exception, at the mercy of brute force. The liberty of the individual is no gift of civilization. It was greatest before there was any civilization, though then, it is true, it had for the most part no value, since the individual was scarcely in a position to defend it. The development of civilization imposes restrictions on it, and justice demands that no one shall escape those restrictions. What makes itself felt in a human community as a desire for freedom may be their revolt against some existing injustice, and so may prove favorable to a further development of civilization. It may remain compatible with civilization, but it may also spring from the remains of their original personality, which is still untamed by civilization, and may thus become the basis in them of hostility to civilization. The urge for freedom, therefore, is directed against particular forms and demands of civilization or against civilization altogether. It does not seem as though any influence could induce a man to change his nature into a termite's. No doubt, he will always defend his claim to individual liberty against the will of the group. A good part of the struggles of mankind center around the single task of finding an expedient accommodation, one that will bring happiness, between this claim of the individual and the cultural claims of the group. And one of the problems that touches the fate of humanity is whether such an accommodation can be reached by means of some particular form of civilization, or whether this conflict is irreconcilable. By allowing common feeling to be our guide in deciding what features of human life are to be regarded as civilized, we have obtained a clear impression of the general picture of civilization. But it is true that so far we have discovered nothing that is not universally known. At the same time, we have been careful not to fall in with the prejudice that civilization is synonymous with perfecting, that is, the road to perfection preordained for men. But now a point of view presents itself, which may lead in a different direction. The development of civilization appears to us as a peculiar process which mankind undergoes, and in which several things strike us as familiar. We may characterize this process with reference to the changes which it brings about in the familiar instinctual dispositions of human beings, to satisfy which is, after all, the economic task of our lives. A few of these instincts are used up in such a manner that something appears in their place, which, in an individual, we describe as a character trait. The most remarkable example of such a process is found in the anal eroticism of young human beings. Their original interest in the excretory function, its organs and products, is changed in the course of their growth into a group of traits which are familiar to us as parsimony, a sense of order and cleanliness, qualities which, though valuable and welcome in themselves, may be intensified till they become markedly dominant and produce what is called the anal character. How this happens, we do not know, but there is no doubt about the correctness of this finding. Now, we have seen that order and cleanliness are important requirements of civilization, although their vital necessity is not very apparent, any more than their suitability as sources of enjoyment. At this point, we cannot fail to be struck by the similarity between the process of civilization and the libidinal development of the individual. Other instincts, besides anal eroticism, are induced to displace the conditions for their satisfaction, to lead them into other paths. In most cases, this process coincides with that of the sublimation of instinctual aims with which we are familiar, but in some, it can be differentiated from it. Sublimation of instinct is an especially conspicuous feature of cultural development. It is what makes it possible for higher psychical activities, scientific, artistic, or ideological, to play such an important part in civilized life. If one were to yield to a first impression, one would say that sublimation is a vicissitude which has been forced upon the instincts entirely by civilization. But it would be wiser to reflect upon this a little longer. In the third place, finally, and this seems the most important of all, it is impossible to overlook the extent to which civilization is built upon a renunciation of instinct, how much it presupposes precisely the non-satisfaction by suppression, repression, or some other means of powerful instincts. This cultural frustration dominates the large field of social relationships between human beings. As we already know, it is the cause of the hostility against which all civilizations have to struggle. It will also make severe demands on our scientific work, and we shall have much to explain here. It is not easy to understand how it can become possible to deprive an instinct of satisfaction, nor is doing so without danger. If the loss is not compensated for economically, one can be certain that serious disorders will ensue. But if you want to know what value can be attributed to our view that the development of civilization is a special process, comparable to the normal maturation of the individual, we must clearly attack another problem. We must ask ourselves to what influences the development of civilization owes its origin, how it arose, and by what its course has been determined.
Okay, thank you, Joanne.
Pleasure.
Again, at least for me, I experienced the surprise of not only rereading this chapter, but also hearing it read out loud. It's an interesting experiment about how resonance operates, and I think it adds to what we are learning here. So thank you, Joanne. I'll give the floor to Veronique for her commentary.
Thank you, Joanne, for your beautiful reading. And for me, if I'm not clear, because it seems my voice is not very audible. So tell me if I need to speak more loudly. Thank you also to Florencia for her very kind introduction of me, but also for having had the prescience or the foresight to see that this period was going to last a long time, and to organize this for, I don't know, day 2 of this crisis. So I'm very grateful to be here with you and to reread this text, Civilization and Its Discontents, which I worked on a long time ago. It was absolutely amazing to reread it, and like Florencia, hearing it read by Joanne is extremely striking, particularly in the clarity of Freud's reflection. And I was noting some of the questions which he asks when I was listening to Joanne. For example, is it possible to reach a better accommodation with another form of civilization? Is the conflict irreconcilable? Extremely precise questions of Freud. I was also very struck to note the faith that Freud has in the plasticity of the libido.
Mm-hmm.
It's extremely clear that there is no other solution than allowing libido to be channeled in different ways, and seems to go to the heart of the Freudian ambivalence, because we always find, and I will try to show it in this text, we always have this idea in Freud that at the same time things could be better, but also we are fucked, basically. And it constantly oscillates between saying there is something which is unresolvable, irreconcilable, and yet we try, with the plasticity of the libido, to find other ways to calculate another manner in which we could live together. So those are the reflections that came to me as I was listening. I'm now going to try and speak to some comments that that came to me when I was working this morning.
Veronique, sorry, just 1 second, because
see the messages as well.
That the sound is not good. Can you explain what is it? Is it too low? Muffled. Okay. One of the suggestions, because it can be something happening on your receiving end, is to try with headphones. So if you're not hearing very well, try using headphones, okay? Sound okay in Omaha, Nebraska. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. All is well in the world.
Okay, we continue.
So I'm going to start with stating a few obvious things, but it's always useful to situate ourselves. So of course we are at a time at which our civilization has produced yet another crisis. We can already see that some commentators surmise that this crisis is due to what Jacques-Alain Miller once encapsulated in the formula, the conjunction of science and capitalism. I think it's in the 1996 seminar, The Other That Does Not Exist, that we find this. What does it mean, this pithy, this formalization of the problem of our time? I think we can say that science supplies the necessary technologies for capitalism to continue dematerializing the real and disavowing the impossible. And we know with Lacan that the impossible needs to be inscribed for there to be an anchoring point for language to take hold. And this conjunction of science and capitalism, in this double effect of dematerializing the real and disavowing the impossible, is producing this sense of things not being situatable or manageable. So at the moment, we are living in a crisis, and it's a crisis, the effect of which is the suspension of truth, we could say. Why? Because the moment to conclude is, for the whole of humanity, suspended at the moment in the absence of a quilting point. We don't have a quilting point as yet that we can use to read what is happening from the perspective of the resolution of the crisis in the after effect. This is the way in which human beings manage with what is happening. Reinterpretation in the after effect, it's the primary cell of the graph of desire. At the moment, we don't have this quilting point that would allow the after effect. Therefore, there is a suspension of the question of truth. In other words, we don't know whether this will have been a well-handled crisis or a wake-up call to capitalism to give up on supporting the fantasy of individual autonomy. We don't know whether it will be the end of the world as we know it. We don't know whether it will have been a mere bump on the road to nowhere on which humanity is intent on hurtling along. We don't know because we don't know how it will end. We don't have the signifying elements which would be necessary to construct an interpretation of what it will all have meant. So we can use this in the suspension of the question of truth. We can use this as a time for understanding. And I think that this is why Florencia's initiative is very precious. We can use this as a time for understanding, in other words, as a pause in the precipitation of our civilization of the instant. We are in everyday life constantly caught between the instant of seeing and the moment to conclude without the time to understand. At the moment, we have this time to understand. And so it's extremely important, it seems to me, to use this time to reflect on the question which Freud eventually placed at the heart of psychoanalysis, and nowhere more clearly than in the text we are reading together in this unprecedented moment. Somebody's asking to repeat the Jacques-Alain Miller quote.
Where is it from?
It's in the first lesson of The Other That Does Not Exist and its ethical committees. Okay, so what is the question which Freud is placing at the heart of psychoanalysis? Why can't men be happy? Even in the limited sense that he affords the term in this text. I remind you of the Freudian definition of happiness, which we can find in the second chapter that Neus commented on last week. This definition is happiness, in the reduced sense in which we recognize it as possible, is a problem of the economics of the individual's libido. Okay, so why can't men be happy even in this reduced sense? In other words, reaching a satisfactory economics for our libido. So this is Freud's question. My question is this Freudian text still pertinent as a deciphering key to read the unhappiness of our times? Indeed, I'm asking this question because many things appear to have changed since Freud wrote it. For instance, our current context is extremely different. We live in the time of globalized consumerism. This is the discursive matrix which produces the effects of subject that we all are. I'm making a shorthand reference to Miller's Millennials' Intuitions, where he says we can only decipher the matrix of civilization looking at the effects of subject that it produces. So the matrix of our civilization is globalized consumerism. So that's one change. Another change is that in these parts of the world that have freed themselves from what Freud called bluntly in this text a mass delusion, i.e. religion, there seem to be no limits to the injunction to enjoy. In this text, the form of consumption. Indeed, religions tend to include guidance on how to manage one's enjoyment and to fulfill a function that Freud introduced later on in Moses and Monotheism as that of the cultural superego. I'm reading a brief quote from Moses and Monotheism. Ethics, Freud says, is thus to be regarded as a therapeutic attempt, as an endeavor to achieve, by means of the command of the superego, something which has so far not been achieved by means of any other cultural activity. Okay, so the second change in our parts of the world where we have freed ourselves from the mass delusion of religion, we are left without the support of such a cultural superego, which would try and direct the drive towards the ideal, if you want.
I had written there as a note, Veronique, this point of if you like, displacement from the ideal to the object. You know, the question is the consequences of that.
So since we could hypothesize, I think fairly uncontroversially, that we are no longer subjects governed by a cultural superego, the ideal in inverted commas, subject of the West is the supposedly universal subject of the scientific renaissance. The problem is that this subject seeks to regulate himself by resorting to the scientific discourse. But in the scientific discourse, we do not have a knowledge of jouissance, un savoir de jouissance. It's the phrase which Neus introduced last week, extracted from Seminar 19, un savoir de jouissance. It means that there is a knowledge which is not a bad jouissance, as Neus was commenting, but it has to do with facing jouissance and knowing how to make do with it. And this knowledge of jouissance, this savoir de jouissance, was deposited in religious practices. This is what Neus developed last week when she was also suggesting that psychoanalysis could be an atheistic alternative to religion in supporting the production of such a savoir de jouissance. So to summarize, Freud's text read in our context. Our context is that of a globalized consumerism where science is at the helm of truth. We can here specify a few of the Lacanian advances. We recall that Lacan proposed an interpretation, that of the superego as a command to enjoy. Lacan proposed that this was the truth of what Freud had characterized as the prohibition to enjoy. This goes to Florencia's point about the object and the idea. So let's examine this ambivalence, which I said was at the heart of the Freudian corpus. I'd like to say that Lacan's interpretation was already present in Freud. In other words, the Freudian superego appears to prohibit certain forms of enjoyment and to demand instinctual renunciation. In fact, always commands this enjoyment. This is apparent from reading, for instance, The Economic Problem of Masochism, a 1924 text in which Freud casts the Kantian moral imperative as the heir to the Oedipus complex. It is in Kant with Sade that Lacan spells out and radicalizes this Freudian insight. The superego is equivalent to the command to enjoy, and confronted with this blind and deaf imperative, speaking beings struggle with finding a limit. In fact, in our times, the liberalization of sexual morality has removed some of the barriers that speaking beings could use to construct enjoyment as prohibited and sustain desire as a transgression. So that's a very important modification. In addition to this liberation or liberalization of sexuality, we can also think about the constant mobility of our times, which resulted in what Jacques-Alain Miller called, at the time of the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris, a deterritorialization of jouissance. In other words, a non-correspondence between a given territory and a cultural organization of enjoyment shared by all inhabitants of that territory. So we have all of these transformations that took place between the time at which Freud wrote Civilization and Its Discontents.
Sorry, Veronique, could you say a little bit more about this last point, the deteriorization?
Well, it was simply relating to the idea that everyone lives everywhere. You no longer have a French mode of enjoyment, a Spanish mode of enjoyment, an Arabic mode of enjoyment, but you have a coexistence of different modes of enjoyment on the same territories, and as a result, an idea of a jouissance that cannot be contained by a shared culture. So I think, for me, it goes together with this notation that Lacan makes in the note on the father. I can read it out if you want.
Yes.
At this point, it's in the Lacanian Review, issue 1. In this extremely short response to Michel de Certeau, Lacan says, "I believe that in our day and age, we could classify the mark, the scar left by the father's disappearance under the heading and general notion of segregation. The common belief is that our civilization's universalism and communication standardize human relations. I, on the contrary, believe that what characterizes our century, and we cannot fail to be aware of it, is a complex, reinforced, and constantly overlapping form of segregation that only manages to generate more and more barriers." So this is Lacan again taking, going against the grain of common sense, where we have the idea that because we are increasingly universal, we will be increasingly tolerant. Lacan is saying the opposite. The more universal we are, the more intolerant we become, and the more we need to redraw boundaries. So this desegregation by means of the discourse of science produces the opposite effect, which is the redrawing boundaries, the attempt to re-territorialize jouissance.
But it's the same with Freud and the tenet of love thy neighbor and religion. The more I'm asked to love my neighbor, the more aggression I feel in that way toward him. It's impossible.
It's a conundrum.
Yeah.
So Freud wrote this text between the two world wars. It also wasn't a very happy time for civilization. And it's the moment at which he asks the question, how is man to find happiness? Is it still pertinent to our times, and how? Indeed, the Freudian text seems to be resting on the hypothesis that Wilhelm Reich, for instance, called the Repressive Hypothesis, and which Michel Foucault took issue with in his History of Sexuality, Volume 1. In this work, Foucault produced a similar interpretation to Lacan's, saying that the supposed sexual repression at play in Western civilization was nothing but an incitement to speak about sex, highlighting for his part the positivity of power. With Lacan, we don't find an idea of the positivity of power, but an idea of the positivity of a jouissance that cannot be negativized and therefore treated by the signifier. Positivity, the positivity of jouissance implies excess, something that cannot be treated with a minus. Lacan initially ascribed such a positivity against Freud to what he called feminine jouissance. If you recall, for Freud, the jouissance of the woman was marked by a minus, the minus the organ. It's a lack in the scopic field. Okay, because the girl says she doesn't have the penis, she's marked by a minus. For Lacan, it's the opposite. Feminine jouissance is not marked by a plus, by a minus, but by a plus. If you want, it's because the woman doesn't have on her body the detumescing organ that she cannot avail herself of a minus. Okay, so it's to summarize very briefly the argument. So Lacan initially circumscribes the problem that Freud was dealing with as that of the positivity of jouissance. And in fact, in the very last teaching of Lacan, feminine of jouissance is cast as the regime of jouissance as such for all speaking beings. It's been formalized by Jacques Miller in 2011. Feminine jouissance is the regime of jouissance as such. In other words, what can we say? We can say that some of jouissance can be treated by language and some can't. This is the Lacanian rendering of the Freudian discontents of civilization. Jouissance is positive, and the more civilization pushes the subject to enjoy, the more this positivity reveals itself in its deleterious dimension. Thus, for instance, we see that addiction has become the shared mode of relation between subject and object. In other words, there is a generalization of compulsion in our civilization. It's in this respect that the Freudian discovery that the object of the drive was distinct from its aim continues to be verified. The object is indifferent to the aim of the drive, which is a satisfaction that takes place at the expense of the well-being of the subject. So we have this, and yet in Civilization and Its Discontents, we have, on the contrary, the ideas of prohibition, renunciation, satisfaction, castration as the price to pay for civilization. We can see that the Freudian idea is very Hobbesian. Thomas Hobbes, the idea of the Leviathan. Thomas Hobbes' idea is that civilization is founded on a trade-off between liberty and security. We find this idea in Freud's text. I'm going to quote it at page 95 in the Standard Edition. The replacement of the power of the individual by the power of the community constitutes the decisive step of civilization. The essence of it lies in the fact that the members of the community restrict themselves in their possibilities of satisfaction, whereas the individual knew no such restriction. In other words, with Thomas Hobbes, we have a beautiful example of the English utilitarianism. Everything is a contract, I give A for B and so on. And we don't ask ourselves about the libidinal conditions for the possibility of civilization. So what is remarkable in the Freudian approach is that he asks himself as to what renders a civilization tolerable or bearable for a human being. In other words, in what instinctual conditions can I tolerate to be a member of my civilization? It's in this sense that even though, for all of the reasons that I've mentioned, we are in an extremely different context, Freud's line of inquiry remains extremely radical. And indeed, it struck me as I was reading this text that such questions had never been asked until Freud thought to ask them. So even though the text or the whole Freudian corpus seems to rest on this idea of sacrifice, prohibition, renunciation, satisfaction, and therefore we seem to have the idea that the price to pay is ascribable to civilization, I would say that Freud is also ambivalent. For example, at the beginning of this third chapter, Freud says, when we consider how unsuccessful we have been in precisely this field of prevention of suffering, a suspicion dawns on us that there too, a piece of unconquerable nature may lie behind, this time a piece of our own psychical constitution. Okay, so the ambivalence of Freud is present in this sentence. On the one hand, civilization attracts hostility because we have to sacrifice, renounce, give up, and so on. On the other hand, a suspicion dawns on us that perhaps it has to do with who we are. In other words, it has to do with the idea that satisfaction is impossible per se, and that men blame civilization for their own unhappiness, which is constitutional. This is what Lacan formalizes with the beautiful simplicity that is his once we stop being befuddled by his strange use of grammar and odd choice of words. Actually, an extremely simple rendering of the Freudian conundrum. I'm going to read, I think it's from Subversion of the Subject. Lacan says, we must insist that jouissance is forbidden to him who speaks as such. Or again, that it can only be said between the lines for whoever is subject of the law, since the law is grounded in its very prohibition. Okay, in other words, Lacan offers a resolution of the Freudian ambivalence by going with the Freudian intuition that it doesn't have to do so much with the structure of civilization, but it has to do with the constitution of a human being in language. Because we speak, satisfaction is impossible. That's what it means to say jouissance is forbidden to him who speaks as such. From the moment at which you speak, you cannot have full, complete satisfaction. Okay, so with Lacan and with the transformations in our civilization that render this extremely visible, we can confront ourselves or interrogate the true difficulty of being a speaking being or a speaking body and existing together in a community. What we can learn from Freud is the approach of a functionalist pragmatist. In other words, when he considers the way in which we organize our social bond, he always asks himself, what are we using something for? Not what does it mean? It's extremely unessential to him what it means. And that's what allows him to, for example, dismiss religion as a delusion and to trace it back always to the subjective conundrum, as we saw in chapter 1, the feeling of infantile helplessness. The other thing that I found absolutely remarkable in this text is Freud's emphasis on the program of the pleasure principle and his idea that the program of the pleasure principle could not accomplish itself because of nature, failing bodies, and annoying others. It's extremely interesting to me because we are governed by the program of the pleasure principle and we are constantly disrupted in the accomplishment of our program. Okay, so if you still have some patience, I can say something more about what I thought was specific about this text beyond the more general sort of discussion that I've provided so far. It seemed to me that in chapter 3 we have something which is extremely important. It's the disenchantment of science.
The
Disillusion with science.
Mm.
And I found extremely interesting that already in 1929, 1930, Freud is extremely dismissive of progress. Okay, progress does not help us. Does not help us with the only true question, which is the question of the regulation of our bodies. If we are speaking in a more Lacanian fashion, the disruption of jouissance will not be helped by science. Freud is extremely lucid on this point, and we can perhaps make two connections with our current discourse. One of the
Sorry, sorry to interject, Veronique, but a question had come there, that perhaps it's linked to this. In terms, a question by Kieran, accelerationism and techno-utopianism, yeah, as having very different versions in the left wing and right wing political discourses. But I interject the question there because I think it's perhaps relative.
Perhaps we can unmute him at some point.
Yeah.
Can I just make one more comment about the text before we do that? Because I was really struck by reading in this chapter this idea of order. I found it very interesting because Freud is speaking about the celestial model. In other words, man is in a state of chaos and he learns order from the regularity of the stars. Man's observation of the great astronomical regularities gave him the first points of departure for introducing order into his life. I found this absolutely amazing. And of course, because of the commentary that Miller did of the transformation of the real in the 21st century. And I wanted to make this point because in the first session, I think Alistair and others were debating as to what the real is. What is the real? And here I wanted to read from Miller's presentation of the theme of the WAP Congress on the real in the 21st century. I'm going to read slowly. Previously, the real was called nature. For me, Freud already knew this. The real was called nature. Nature was the name of the real when there was no disorder in the real. When nature was the name of the real, you could say, as Lacan did, that the real always returns to the same place. Only in this epoch in which the real disguised itself as nature, the real appeared as the most evident, the most elevated manifestation of the very concept of order. We find this in Freud. The return of the real in the same place is, of course, opposed to the signifier, inasmuch as what characterizes the signifier is displacement, Entstellung, as Freud says. The signifier is connected, substituted in a metaphorical or metonymic mode, and always returns in unexpected and surprising places. By contrast, the real in this epoch, where it was confused with nature, was characterized by not surprising. One could calmly await its appearance in the same place on the same date. So here we have the idea, if you want, that faced with the constant displacement of the signifier, the celestial model was anchoring the relation of man to the world. So, in other words, the real as nature provide a model for the symbolic, that things can be ordered. And today, with the dissociation of the real from nature, we have a new definition of the real, which Miller gives in this text as disorder. The real is disorder. In other words, the real is that which cannot be ordered. That's at the beginning of my presentation when I said there is a dematerialization of the real. That's what it means. It means that science transforms the real by constantly acting on it, the real as natural. So the real as natural can no longer function as the model for order. And the consequence of this is the endless displacement of the signifier. So that was an element of the text which I found extremely, extremely important. And the other element of the text, which I find maybe worth commenting on further, is this idea of science as being, if you want, the alternative to religion. Science, I said, it's at the helm of truth. When there is no religion, science is at the helm of truth, but science is impotent when it comes to the regulation of jouissance. And here I'm going to try and translate from Jacques-Alain Miller's lecture, Extimité. It's, I think, 1985, 1986 course. You still have some patience to listen for a long quote?
Yes,
I'm going
for sure.
translate it as I'm going, because I only have it in French. So if you want, it's a development of Lacan's thesis in Science and Truth. If science is profoundly desegregating, says Miller, in its technical consequences, it is because its discourse exploits a very pure mode of the subject, a mode which I would say universalized of the subject. The discourse of science is a discourse which is designed for everyone and by everyone. Who thinks, I think, therefore I am. So we recognize the thesis of Science and Truth that the subject of science is the subject of the Cartesian cogito. This discourse cancels out subjective particularities. In this sense, the function of science as universal goes against racism, nationalism, ideology. It is extremely agreeable, but it leads to a universal ethics which introduces development as the only value. Never mind that. But what I want to add is what Miller then says. There is a consequence as regards the response to be given to the imperative of jouissance to which we are all enslaved. The scientific discourse has nothing that can be responded, given the universal mode in which it is developing itself. And then there are some comments about sexual education as an attempt to answer to that. Then he says it is because science fails that psychoanalysis finds its place to the extent that it is the discourse that seeks to address the paradoxes of jouissance. So those are my comments on this text. We can see that Freud had already, if you want, had the intuition that science would have nothing to say about the paradoxes of jouissance. Even in this very funny phrase, what's the point of living forever if your life is miserable? You can say it's Freud's version of the paradox of jouissance. Yes, science will make you live forever, but it will not make you happy. So science is not the discourse that will make you happy.
But one of the very interesting things for us to do is to follow the responses that different discourses are giving to the question of longevity and the fact that people today live past 90 years old, 100 years old, and
So the response of science is always the same. It's always, we will find the law of nature and we will act on the law of nature. If you're not happy with your gender, we will modify your biology so that you are happy with your gender. So it's always an intervention at the level of finding the laws of nature and rectifying the cause of your unhappiness in the real of your organism. We will make you with bigger breasts, look younger, be a different gender, have a child via a surrogate mother, and so on. It's the perfect example of the conjunction of science and capitalism, bioeconomy.
We are getting already very interesting remarks and comments, and we have some questions. Thank you very much, Veronique, for this reading. It allows us to not sit so comfortably in this perhaps tendency we have to go back to read Freud and imagine that everything was there already. Yeah, the push to read Lacan as if he wasn't introducing a new positioning, a new place from where to attempt to meet the horizon of our times, and of course how to resist also the temptation to become enclosed in our own way of interpreting, to go back to the first meeting and this idea of reading. So I think this is very helpful, the exercise that you've proposed to us. So there are a few questions. I'm not sure whether it's better for people that we open the mics as they. I'm calling now to Linda to see if there's anyone who would like to intervene, pose a question at this point. I did write a few. There's a question from Marina about the footnote that we read, woman appointed guardian of fire, and its relationship with feminine jouissance. I'm of course very biased in thinking. Veronique,
What's the question?
what do you have to say about that?
Well, I never peed on a fire.
But what
I don't know how to make one.
was it not also in mythology of Proteus with the gods bringing the fire, and he gave it to the woman he loved, and that's what was the end of him? So there is something of the jouissance of the woman there, maybe, in this story.
No, I mean, for Freud, it's always an attempt at, to be extremely, because I think Freud's attempt at being, I think Freud tries very hard to not be delusional. And his way to not be delusional is to base all of his interventions on observation. And because we saw this in the first chapter, he believes that the individual psyche is constructed historically. For him, it's always a matter of refining a reason for what he observes in his practice historically. He always does that. It's his way of not falling prey to the discourse of religion, the discourse of science, the discourse of philosophy. So that's it's his way of perhaps saying that the men struggle more with renouncing phallic satisfaction than women, because women already have renounced it.
Mm.
To one extent, something like that. But perhaps what I wanted to add about the place of psychoanalysis, because we already find in this text the Freudian compass. The Freudian compass is the plasticity of libido. And for me, it's really a very crucial orientation, because we know that the quantum of jouissance does not change. The drive is a constant craft and so on. So the only thing that can change is what we do with it. And I find this extremely clearly developed by Freud when he speaks about intoxication, sublimation, and so on. And we see that the Freudian solution is always sublimation. There is no other alternative to the human struggle than sublimation. Because in any case, you cannot negativize the positivity of reason. He already says that. So the plasticity of the libido is the Freudian solution. And for me, it's something which you find in Lacan's idea of desire as a defense. Because what is desire? Desire is a metonymy. It has the structure of metonymy. In other words, it has the structure of displacement. It avoids a fixation of jouissance. And it's the fixation which is pathogenic. So it's an orientation for psychoanalysis, I think.
Okay, there's another question, the one I mentioned there, about acceleration, I don't know how to pronounce this, accelerationism, techno-utopianism.
Can that person be unmuted, because I don't really know these discourses.
Okay, yeah. Linda, if you can unmute Kieran. There.
Myself. Hi.
Hi, Karen.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Not so much a question as observation, because I read a book recently that touched on ideas. It's called accelerationism, and it has like a left-wing version and a right-wing. The right-wing version is like kind of survival of the fittest, speed up technological progress, and the strong will survive, the weak will do what they must. And then the left-wing version is more around the idea of fully automated luxury communism is one book that was written on it. So it's like harnessing technology, the good of everybody, but they have a lot of the common theme is technological progress, but they come at it from very different angles. And it seems to me, maybe, I guess it came to mind, I guess, just listening to the text. That's not a question. It's just, I guess it's just a different way of thinking about it, or it's a very current debate, maybe in different circles.
Yes, yes. I wonder if Gustavo de Sal is there. If he's there, can you raise your hand? Because I think he deals with a lot of these questions in his last book on technologies, use of technologies and the unconscious. But
like one art movement, the Futurists, an Italian art movement, and it was one of the very few kind of fascist leaning art movements. They had a very strong idea of technological progress and at the time. But what was interesting was that in their context, they were very behind in terms of manufacturing and so on. So they really kind of fantasized about getting all these things that, say, England had at the time.
Is Gustavo here?
no.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. There was another question before I go to that one. Does anyone want to raise their hands, or tell us from here, from the chat, if you have any aspect of the chapter we read today, or any remarks that you want to make. Benjamin Ramy. There is symmetry for Freud between individual normal maturation and civilization. The establishment of civilization and prohibition can then be compared with the individual's history in alienation, separation, and the necessity of choosing to be in language. And yet there is a lie present in the Hobbesian worldview that uncivilized life was poor, brutish, short, etc. That is also presence in the promise of subjectivity. Thank you, Benjamin. Thomas Svolos has raised his hand.
Yeah. Can you hear okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to thank Joanne for the reading, and Veronique, a wonderful commentary, which all three of the prior commentaries just makes my job next week all the more difficult to say something as enlightening as what you said today. So I wanted to just make a very small point about science, because this has come up a couple times earlier, and it came up again a couple times today, particularly with regard to what Veronique had to say about following Freud, the idea of order and the relationship of science and order, which is, it'll be very interesting to me to see if the pandemic has an effect on science itself. In other words, could this encounter with what we're dealing with now have something to do that will change the conduct of the scientific discourse, and how scientists work? I can tell you for sure, simply because I have to work together with quite a few scientists in the medical school, that they talk of very interesting changes in the conduct of science, how they share data, publications. It's something that's a very interesting thing in the scientific world. And the other thing, perhaps more relevant to the point today about science, is there was a very interesting article this week in the New York Times about a science that includes uncertainty. In other words, a science, and this is not the first time I've read this kind of thing, but a science that includes uncertainty within the science. So in other words, a science, you could almost say a science that is able to include the disorder within the discourse of the science itself. I mean, we had this probably 15, 20 years ago with chaos theory, and there's been these other developments in science where, can the science not just be an ordering lawful science, but a science that somehow is able to, within its discourse, have that incorporated into the discourse. And I wonder personally if having to deal with the social phenomenon and the medical and the pandemic and so forth will have an effect on science itself. It's not really a question, it's just a comment, an observation.
I think, Thomas, that it's a very apt comment to try to distinguish in the current world between science, the field of science, scientism, and the sanitary bureaucracies, which I think the United States is perhaps the greatest representative of the tensions and the distinctions of those fields. Veronique, what would you say?
Completely, I have absolutely nothing against science. Huh? It's the idea of science at the helm of truth, which I find problematic, and it's what Lacan says in Seminar 17, Chapter 11. If you remember this idea that there is this this hijacking of truth by science as a discourse. But of course, I'm thinking about the two amazing interviews which were published in the issue of the Lacanian Review, Get Real.
Yeah.
And we had an interview with a quantum physicist, which was absolutely amazing, and with, I think, an astrologist speaking about black holes and quantum physics and so on. So, of course, there is a science that includes uncertainty, and it's much closer to psychoanalysis. To me, when I read these interviews, I thought we have much more in common with quantum physicists than we have with psychologists as psychoanalysts, because it's trying to have a knowledge of something which cannot be known, like this savoir de jouissance, which Neus extracted in her commentary last week, which was
there's a question perhaps there that can be connected with this by Dionysius Pascalis. He says, in Tom Robbins' Still Life with Woodpecker, a fantasy is mentioned in which the male protagonist teaches the female protagonist how to synchronize her menstruation with the lunar cycle. Could we say that this fantasy is the real of nature, while the lawless real that Miller describes is something along the lines of an unstable and unstabilizable menstruation? Can the problem of feminine jouissance be raised in terms of female biology, or is such a biologization considered metaphoric?
What can I answer to this? It's okay. So the organizing principle of the symbolic order is the binary signifier. Okay, so the symbolic order functions by opposing pairs: black, white, man, woman, white, adult, national, foreigner, and so on. The symbolic orders by creating binaries. Okay, and it's worked in that way until perhaps the 80s, 90s, where suddenly we had a whole calling into question of the binary organization of the world. Nowhere more evident than in the gender discourse. And to the extent that now we've reached a consensus that the only tenable solution in terms of gender was non-binary. I find it extremely precise because it names the transformation of the symbolic order. The symbolic order can no longer be binary. It has to accommodate non-binary. The fact that we are dealing with something which cannot be ordered by means of a pair. And I don't think it's by chance that what we have seen appearing in the past 20, 30 years is the idea of a spectrum or a series. So we have a
spectrum, yes.
The autistic spectrum, the
gender spectrum.
Gender spectrum, and nobody wants to define themselves in terms of a binary anymore. It seems to me that Lacan already knew this. He was already aware of this, because I remember working on Seminar 9 last year, and I don't have it extremely clearly in mind, but Lacan says in that basically since Aristotle, we've organized the world in terms of everything that is not A is A, and everything that is A is not A. The Aristotelian logic, which is to organize the world by means of categories. A woman is not a man, and a man is and so on and so forth. And Lacan says that this logic, the binary logic, has reached its limit, and that what psychoanalysis can offer in the place of the binary ordering of the world is by producing a logic of the object of desire. Lacan has this idea from Seminar 9 that it's possible to think in other ways than in a binary way about the human experience. And then from that point on, it tries to produce tools with which to think the logic of design. And that's when we have the introduction of the object A and topology and so on and so forth. Except, of course, human beings always return to the master signifier, as the easiest way of ordering. But it's a way which is being increasingly resisted by speaking beings themselves.
We have Natalie Wolfing as well. Your mic is on, Natalie.
Hi, Natalie.
Natalie was posing a question, if I can find it, about the prosthetic gods, prosthetic gods, which make on think of object as a partner of satisfaction and the rise of individualized enjoyment of technology.
I can't see Natalie's question. Where is it?
Yeah, it's a little bit further up. Natalie, are you there?
She says, "Can you not hear me?"
No, we can't hear you. Maybe your microphone is not connected.
You put this prosthetic gods.
What about there?
Well, I mean, we are talking about. Mic is on, but you can't hear me.
Okay.
I mean, I suppose what can we say in a way that the other does not exist? The other does not exist. It means that the other with which we ordered what happened to us by means of the binary, S1, S2, we have to find other ways psychoanalytically. And this is why we have Lacan introducing this concept of the one, il y a de l'un, the symptôme, and so on, because it has to do with what can we do when the other as subject supposed to know how to order my experience of my jouissance by means of the binary of knowledge. What do we do when that no longer functions? Does it mean that psychoanalysis is defunct? And the attempt, for example, of Éric Laurent and so on, to theorize transference at the time of the one all alone, that has to do with trying to think of psychoanalysis at the time of the inoperativity of the binary pair. And this is why, for example, in his conference at the WOP Congress in Barcelona, he said that psychoanalysis used to be about faire être, to make be, and now it has to do with to make true. Faire vrai. In other words, to produce an effect in the experience of jouissance that each organism traversed by the drive has. It's not a question of resorbing that jouissance into being, in other words, knowledge and so on, but it's about producing an effect of truth, which allows the subject to use his symptom, I mean, to say in a very, very short hand.
We have a few minutes left. Perhaps, Joanne, do you want to intervene, to say something?
I think I have a question, but I can't quite formulate it. I'll try my best. There were a few things that you said about science and science not knowing anything about jouissance. And I was thinking about the jouissance of science, that it has its own jouissance in this, what you called a disavowal of the impossible. And I wondered about that in relation to, you know, when Freud is speaking about the superego being one of the greatest artifacts of civilization, that science, can we say, or capitalism has become a form of superegoic agency now in civilization. It's just a question. I don't know if I'm saying it very well, but in terms of the rise of jouissance and the collapse of say, desire.
I've got a very interesting patient at the moment. I call her my Kantian patient, because she organizes subjectivity with Kant. People do that. But for her, you can is equivalent to you must. And I think it's very much the effect of the conjunction of science and capitalism. You can have a baby by whatever way, therefore you must. You can look younger, therefore you must. You can. There is this idea of the injunctive nature of the signifier, which becomes more stronger and stronger with the weakening of the S2. Because the S2 is no longer able to interpret with sufficient credibility the event of jouissance that we all experience. The imperative nature of the signifier is felt in a much stronger form. So the question is really how to treat this imperative effect, which means that because you can, you must.
And it's interesting because you were speaking about segregation, and of course now everyone is in lockdown, and our movements are controlled in a way that is quite extraordinary for us to try and understand. And one thing that I've been seeing is, because it reminded me so much of this paper, is manifestations of violence and civil disobedience, pockets of it happening. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that. I mean, even in hospitals, there's violence breaking out in the streets, and there's breaking the law. Just wondered if you had any comment about that.
Maybe the first thing that came to me when you started to speak is the fact that many of us that work remotely now, we've been able to observe this, that there is a huge relief in confinement. One of my analysts said confinement is freedom, because it's precisely a freedom from you can, therefore you must. There is a relief in the encountering of a limit. You can't, therefore you don't have to. So that's very remarkable. I think it's really limited, that crazy injunction that you must constantly be as beautiful as you can, as successful as you can, do as many activities as you can, sleep with as many people as you can, and so on. That's been completely limited. And so that's my first comment. The second comment about violence. I mean, for me, I think we worked on this together, Joanne. It was Miller's text on violent children.
Yes, that's right.
We published it in TLR 5 or 6, I can't remember which one, but Miller was saying that violence was the satisfaction of the drive without displacement. So it was another way of understanding it in other terms than in terms of aggressiveness. We are used to containing violence as a phenomenon in the imaginary register. But what Miller did in this text was to extend violence beyond the confines of aggressiveness, and to try and say something about violence itself, which I found quite useful. And this is why perhaps we can say that the only compass for psychoanalysis is the symptom. It's the symptom, because the symptom is a displacement. It provides the possibility for a displacement. Whereas violence is the simple satisfaction of the death drive, I think, as Miller puts it.
So the confinement is limiting possibilities for sublimation, for displacement, for different things in relation to the drive. People are inventing new ones, but this is also a symptom in terms of, as you're saying, the aggression. What you spoke about, the object and the aim of the drive, and what happens with that. It will find something else.
I don't know if I understand your comment, but it seems to me that what Miller is saying in that particular text is that violence is what happens when there is no symptom.
Yes. So there isn't a symbolic inscription in terms of the symptom, or a writing in terms of the
direct discharge.
Yes.
tomorrow.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
I would like to thank Veronique and Joanne again for today, and everyone who joined in and contributed. We are in this forced sublimatory space that we find ourselves in. We are thinking of creative ways to do something with all the contributions that all participants bring. So you'll hear more about that. We look forward to meeting you again next week for our fourth meeting with reader Raphael Montague and commentator Thomas Svolos. So thank you, everyone, and we'll continue next week.
Thanks, Florencia.
Have a good week.
Veronique.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
See
you.
next week. Bye.